Mattias Desmet, as you know, he's a world-renowned, and everyone hates him right now. Not everyone, but anti-thinkers, I think, really dislike him. He has a very interesting background with clinical psychiatry and as a statistician as well. And he teaches at University of Ghent in Belgium. And Professor, it's so good to have you. I've been really looking forward to this. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Dana.
Of course. I want to get your response to this because just like, for instance, here just in the United States in the past week, there's been this huge push for, masking. And this has all been predicated upon, well, because it's going to save lives. There's going to be so many fatalities if people don't do this. And of course, this is year 2 into this pandemic, which, raises questions as to why they're saying this now with N95 masks. But I wanted to get your thoughts because this comes back to what you've been discussing quite a bit, mass formation psychosis, and having people unify around a particular variable. And they think that they're doing something very courageously. They're being very gallant. They're all banding together to fight this common enemy. But is it really based on actual fact and science? And are we using the best approach? Or is this just really a tactic to make it easier to control people?
Well, if it is really an intentionally developed tactic to control people, that's something that goes beyond my expertise. But what is definitely true is that when a process of mass formation emerges in a society, it becomes easier to control the people. That's for sure. And I truly believe that such a process has been going on.
Yes.
In our society.
You've said that there are 4 basic conditions for a society to become vulnerable when talking about mass psychosis, mass hypnosis, that there are 4 basic conditions which must be met. And I know one of those was lack of any kind of bonding in society. Because there's so many different groups, everyone's taught to sort of react to a different offense with every other group. Talk to us a little bit about these 4 steps, beginning with that lack of unity, that lack of societal bonding.
Yes, lack of social bond is the most crucial condition that has to be fulfilled in order for mass formation to emerge. And it was definitely fulfilled in the years before the corona crisis. For instance, the US Surgeon General mentioned that there was a loneliness epidemic in the States. And in the UK, Theresa May appointed a minister of loneliness because she acknowledged that the extent of the problem. So that's always the most crucial condition. Many people have to feel socially isolated. The more people feel socially isolated, the more intense the processes of mass formation become. And then, from this condition follows a second one. A lack of meaning-making and sense-making. When people feel socially isolated, being really social beings, people are social beings, and if they feel socially isolated, they will usually experience a lack of meaning-making and a lack of sense-making in life. They will start to wonder what they live for. And then, from these 2 conditions, follows a third one, which is high levels of so-called free-floating anxiety. Free-floating anxiety is a kind of anxiety that is not connected to a mental representation. That means that people feel anxious without knowing what they feel anxious for. In contrast with, if people feel anxious for, let's say, a dangerous animal or dangerous dog, they know what they are anxious for, and they can control that anxiety by developing a strategy to escape from the object of anxiety. But if you don't know what you feel anxious for, you cannot control it. You cannot control that anxiety. And then, from the first 3 conditions, follows the last one, which is high levels of free-floating frustration and aggression. So people, when they feel socially isolated, feel a lack of meaning-making, feel constantly anxious without knowing what they feel anxious for, will get frustrated and aggressive without knowing what they feel frustrated and aggressive for. These are the 4 basic conditions. If a population, if a society is in this kind of state, then it becomes vulnerable for mass formation. And we can see this from historical examples, such as the large-scale mass formations in the Soviet Union, just before the rise of the Soviet Union and just before the rise of Nazi Germany. Then these 4 conditions were met, and then this large-scale mass formation happened.
And we're seeing that We're really seeing that now with all of this with the pandemic and the regulations and government responses. We're talking to Professor Mattias Desmet on mass formation psychosis. I've seen so many headlines, Professor, trying to delegitimize what you're discussing and what other people have referenced with this. They say it's junk science or that it's made up, which I'm not, for me, I don't know how they can make these allegations because we see it all throughout history, whatever they want to call it. We've seen this play out concretely throughout history. What do you say to those detractors and those critics who are trying to just ignore this?
Yes, I believe it's absurd to say even that mass formation does not exist as an academic term or as a theoretical term, because it simply refers to the process through which a mass forms, to which a mass emerges in society. So it's absurd, and it has been studied since 200 years by major scholars such as Le Bon, Gustave Le Bon, McDougall, Canetti, Hannah Arendt, and then also by experimental psychologists such as Ash and Sharif. So I would not know why such a term would not exist, or why a phenomenon would not exist. Of course it exists.
Exactly.
And it's very difficult. The logic of the process is very clear, because once these four conditions are met and a narrative is distributed in society, which indicates an object of anxiety and provides a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, then all this free-floating anxiety couples to the object of anxiety in the narrative, and there is a huge willingness in the population to participate in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. So people all together start a heroic battle with the object of anxiety. And in this way, they are able to mentally control their anxiety. And at the same time, a new kind of social bond emerges. It's a collective heroic battle. And this social bond, this new social bond, is the real reason why people buy into the narrative. Because it leads to the social bond, not because the narrative is correct or right. It's just because it leads to the social bond. And that explains why, even when the narrative becomes utterly absurd and blatantly wrong, people continue to buy into it. People continue to go along with it because it leads to this new solidarity, this new citizenship. We can even say more. The more absurd the measures become and the narrative becomes, the more a certain part of the population, it's rather small, 25, 30% usually, the more this part of the population will applaud it, simply because the corona measures actually become a kind of rituals through which the individual shows that the collective, the solidarity, is more important than its individual interests. And that's what ritualistic behavior is. A ritual is a kind of behavior which has no pragmatic meaning, and through which the individual sacrifices a part of its individual interests for the sake of the group. So that's the psychological function for a certain part of the population of the corona measures. And that explains why, no matter how absurd the measures and the narrative become, people continue to buy into it.
And why they still do so, even in the face of hard fact. We're talking with Dr. Mattias Desmet on mass formation psychosis, because this was something that you've had conversations before, for instance, about the fatality rates as it relates to the pandemic, before there had even been massive widespread testing on a wide scale. We were already determining fatality rates, and that was being used. People were so terrified of this. And then, as you were mentioning, the response, they all wanted to unite to fight this one common enemy. But what was it based up on? It kind of reminds me of this hurt and rescue tactic. Here you have, you're causing the pain and then also providing the solution for it as a method of control. But before there had been widespread testing done, people were trying to determine fatality rates, but I'm not quite sure how you can have ever even made that calculation without doing the necessary math in order to even get to, it didn't make any sense. It was the cart before the horse. And so that goes along as an example of what you're saying with the pandemic.
Yes. In the beginning of the pandemic, from the first week on, I started to study, because as you said, I also have got a master in statistics. And they started to study the figures and the graphs and the statistics and the mathematical models that were used. And they noticed immediately that usually they dramatically overrated the dangerousness of the virus. That was something that they noticed immediately. And all the mathematical models, the counting of the contaminations and stuff, and then also the basic statistics like the infection fatality rate, I always noticed that there was a tendency to dramatically overrate the dangerousness of the virus. And there was also something else. From the beginning, there was no proper cost-benefit analysis. It was as if the collateral damage caused by the measures was not taken into account. And while this is the most basic consideration you would want to make, like will the remedy not be worse than the disease? And in one way or another, not only the experts, but also a major part of the population didn't seem to notice that there could be a huge collateral damage which very probably would be worse than the damage that could be claimed by the virus. So it was then that I started to think, what is there going on in society that something like this can happen? And that I think it's perfectly explained by the process of mass formation, which always leads to this narrowing of the field of attention, which makes that only one type of danger is still considered, and which makes that this specific threat is highly overrated and highly dramatically overestimated. So that was, for me, that was the beginning, the observation that the numbers and the figures in one way or another distorted reality.
Talking with Professor Desmet, you had made mention before of how this is really this has been used before with the different issues, whether it's been we're talking about totalitarian governments, but also you gave the example in a previous discussion about climate. But this issue with the pandemic, the reason you were suggesting that it's more successful in using this virus as opposed to climate is because it can be so easily personalized. The death of a loved one, it's obviously it's much more, people can actually envision this, and it's more terrifying. It induces more anxiety.
Yes indeed. And yes, absolutely. And you cannot only be blamed for your own death, but also for the death of someone else. And that makes that I think that this narrative about the virus was so successful and had such a psychological grip on the population. Yes, and of course it's an invisible enemy. It's a very good object of anxiety, a virus, I believe.
Oh yes. Well, last question for you, and we're talking with Professor Mattias Desmet, who is the I guess you're the godfather of the mass formation psychosis theory, for the lack of a better way to put it, and really educating people on this, which I really appreciate your first U.S. Broadcast interview with us. So here's the big question. We are recognizing what is happening with mass formation psychosis, but how is there a way to disrupt that process?
Yes. There is a way to disrupt this process, I believe. Maybe not immediately, but mass formation brings people in a state that is identical to hypnosis. And hypnosis is a phenomenon, is a mental state that is provoked by the voice of someone. That's why totalitarian leaders, and the totalitarian state is always based on mass formation, and that makes it radically different from, let's say, a classical dictatorship. You cannot compare the two, actually. Right. So, and that's why, because totalitarian leaders always start the day with half an hour of propaganda, because they know that the state of the population that is needed in order to be in control is provoked by the voice of a leader or an expert, or no matter what. And as soon as you understand that, you also understand that if you want to make the hypnosis less deep, then there has to be a dissonant voice in public space. So the most important thing we can do is to continue to speak out. That's the most important thing we can do. Because if we continue to speak out, the hypnosis, we won't be able to wake up the people who are in the process of mass formation immediately. And again, this is only a minor part of the population. It's only about 25 to 30%, but then there is an additional 40 to 60% who just goes along with the masses while they know that there is something absurd in the narrative.
And this is why the dissidents are very, that's why they're suppressed and why they're attacking you. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I so appreciate it. Dr. Mattias Desmet on mass formation psychosis. Thank you so much for speaking out on this. We really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, Dana.
Of course.